5 minutes after the moving truck left, 3 HOA board members stormed onto my private pier, demanding I tear it down immediately. What they didn't know was that every boat slip they could see, every dock they were standing on, and the entire marina behind them belonged to me. The woman leading this charge was about to learn she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. And honestly, watching her face when the truth came out was worth every penny of the headache she was about to cause me. Before I tell you how this played out, I'm curious. Drop a comment and let me know what country or state you're watching from. I have a feeling this HOA nightmare might be more universal than we think, and I'd love to see where all of you are dealing with your own neighborhood dictators. My name is Dashiell Kensington, but everyone calls me Dash. If you'd told me 6 months ago that I'd be living in a small waterfront cabin fighting off entitled suburbanites, I would have laughed. 6 months ago, I was running a cryptocurrency mining operation that I'd built from nothing into something worth $47 million. Yeah, you heard that right. When Bitcoin hit its peak, I sold everything. The servers, the facilities, the contracts, all of it. I was 34 years old and completely burnt out from the digital world, staring at screens 18 hours a day, managing operations that existed only in cyberspace. I wanted something real, something I could touch, something that connected me to the physical world again. That's when I found this listing for a waterfront cabin. Nothing fancy, just $900,000 for what looked like a simple retreat property. But what caught my eye wasn't the cabin itself. It was a small footnote buried in the property description about existing maritime commercial agreements and something called riparian rights that came with the deed. Most people would have glossed right over that legal jargon. But my brain was wired differently after years of reading complex cryptocurrency contracts. When something seems too technical to matter, that's usually when it matters most. So, I called the listing agent and asked for a meeting with the seller, an elderly woman named Mrs. Peaton, who'd been trying to settle her late husband's estate for 2 years. The day I met Mrs. Peaton at the property, I could tell she was overwhelmed by paperwork she didn't understand. Her husband had been dead for 18 months, and she kept apologizing for not knowing more about his business dealings. The cabin itself was modest, maybe 100-200 square feet, but it sat on prime waterfront real estate with a private pier that extended nearly 200 feet into the harbor. What really caught my attention was when Mrs. Peaton handed me this massive ring of boat keys, at least 30 different keys of various sizes, and said, "These might be important, but I never figured out what they all open." My husband was always down at the docks, talking to captains and signing papers, but I stayed focused on the house and garden. She seemed almost embarrassed by her lack of knowledge about the maritime side of the property. As we walked down to the pier, I noticed details that didn't quite add up for a simple residential property. There were commercial-grade cleats for mooring large vessels, industrial electrical hookups rated for serious power loads, and what looked like fuel lines running underground toward the water. The pier itself was built to handle significant weight and weather, far more robust than anything a recreational boat owner would need. But the biggest clue was the activity I could see across the harbor. Commercial crab fishing boats were heading out for their morning runs. Luxury yacht charters were preparing for weekend excursions, and there was a constant flow of maritime traffic that suggested serious business operations. When I asked Mrs. Peaton about it, she just shrugged and said her husband always told her the water business was complicated, and she should leave it to the men who understood such things. That afternoon, I made an offer on the property, and Mrs. Peaton accepted immediately. She seemed relieved to have someone take the whole complicated mess off her hands, and I was excited about the possibility of owning something tangible after years of dealing with digital assets. The closing went smoothly, and I arranged to move in the following month, planning to spend some time figuring out exactly what I'd bought before making any major decisions about the future. 3 weeks later, the moving truck arrived at 8:00 a.m. On a crisp Saturday morning in early October, I'd hired professional movers because, frankly, after the cryptocurrency windfall, I could afford to make life easy on myself, My belongings weren't extensive since I'd been living a pretty minimalist lifestyle, focused more on building wealth than accumulating stuff. The movers were efficient and friendly, and by noon, they were loading up to head back to their depot. I was standing on my new pier, breathing in the salt air, and feeling genuinely peaceful for the first time in years when I noticed 3 people marching down the waterfront path toward my property. Their body language was unmistakably aggressive, purposeful striding that suggested they were on some kind of mission. The woman leading the group was probably in her mid-40s, perfectly dressed in what looked like expensive maritime-themed clothing. But something about the way she carried herself suggested she was more comfortable in boardrooms than around actual boats. She reached my pier and didn't bother with introductions or pleasantries. "I'm Serafina Westmont, president of the Coastal Haven Homeowners Association, and we need to discuss your immediate compliance with community maritime standards." Her tone was the kind of condescending authority that immediately made my skin crawl, like she was talking to a child who'd been caught breaking rules they should have known better than to break. Behind her were 2 other board members, a nervous-looking man in his 60s who kept checking his phone, and a woman about Serafina's age who was taking photos of my pier with professional intensity. They positioned themselves like they owned the space, spreading out across the dock in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. I tried to keep my voice level and polite, but I could feel tension building in my chest. "I'm Dash Kensington, and this is my property. I just closed on it 3 weeks ago, so I'm not sure what standards you're referring to, but I'm happy to discuss any legitimate concerns you might have." I figured this was probably some kind of welcome wagon situation that had gotten off on the wrong foot. Maybe a misunderstanding about HOA rules that we could clear up with a friendly conversation. Serafina's response made it clear this wasn't going to be friendly. "This primitive fishing setup is completely incompatible with our community's vision for waterfront excellence." She gestured dismissively at my small fishing boat, which I'd been planning to use for some recreational crab trapping, and at the pier itself, which admittedly had seen better days but was structurally sound and perfectly functional. The other woman finished taking her photos and joined the conversation with an authoritative tone that matched Serafina's energy. "These commercial fishing implements violate our aesthetic guidelines for residential waterfront properties. The presence of industrial-grade equipment creates an unsightly disruption to the carefully maintained ambiance our community has worked years to establish." Satyouf looked around at what they were calling commercial fishing implements, trying to understand what they were seeing that I wasn't. My setup consisted of a 24-foot fishing boat that I'd bought used, some basic crab traps I'd picked up at a marine supply store, and the existing pier infrastructure that came with the property. Nothing I owned was particularly industrial or commercial in nature, certainly nothing that should have triggered this level of concern from a homeowners association. But what really confused me was their reference to community standards and aesthetic guidelines. During the purchase process, nobody had mentioned HOA restrictions, and my attorney had specifically confirmed that the property wasn't subject to any homeowners association covenants or restrictions. I'd been careful about that because I'd heard enough horror stories about HOA overreach to want to avoid those complications entirely. That's when the nervous man spoke up for the first time, consulting what looked like a legal document printed on official letterhead. According to Section 4.7 of our Community Maritime Regulations, any waterfront property owner engaged in commercial fishing activities must obtain prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee and demonstrate compliance with established aesthetic standards. The whole situation was starting to feel surreal. I'd been on the property for less than 4 hours, hadn't engaged in any commercial fishing activities, and was being lectured about regulations that I was pretty sure didn't legally apply to my property. But rather than escalate the confrontation, I decided to try a diplomatic approach and see if we could find some common ground. "Look, I think there might be some confusion here about what kind of activities I'm planning and what authority your HOA actually has over this property. I bought this place specifically because it wasn't subject to HOA restrictions, and I have no intention of operating any kind of commercial fishing business. This is just personal recreational equipment for my own use. Serafina's expression shifted from condescending to openly hostile, and I could see that diplomacy wasn't going to be effective with someone who'd already made up her mind about the outcome she wanted. Personal recreation that disrupts community standards is still a violation of our neighborhood character preservation requirements, she said. You have 72 hours to dismantle this pier and remove all fishing-related equipment, or we'll be forced to pursue legal remedies. The ultimatum hit me like a physical blow, not because I was particularly intimidated by their threats, but because of the sheer audacity of someone demanding that I tear down infrastructure on my own property, based on regulations that probably didn't even apply to me. I'd just spent $900,000 on this place, and now some self-appointed neighborhood authority figure was trying to dictate what I could and couldn't do with it. As if the situation wasn't absurd enough, that's when I heard the deep horn blast of a large commercial vessel passing through the harbor. The sound echoed across the water, and I turned to see a massive fishing boat, probably 80 feet long, heading out toward the open ocean. The name painted on its hull read Sea Titan, and as it passed my pier, the captain gave a respectful wave in my direction, the kind of acknowledgement that suggested familiarity rather than casual politeness. Serafina noticed the interaction and used it to reinforce her point about my supposed violation of community standards. See, exactly what I'm talking about. Your little hobby operation is encouraging this kind of disruptive maritime traffic right through our residential area. These commercial vessels have no business operating so close to our luxury waterfront community. I found her comment fascinating for several reasons, not least of which was her assumption that I had any control over commercial maritime traffic in a public harbor. But there was something else in her tone, a kind of territorial possessiveness that suggested she viewed the entire waterfront area as her personal domain rather than a shared community resource. The woman with the camera finished documenting what she seemed to consider evidence of my violations and rejoined the conversation with renewed authority. We'll be filing a formal complaint with the county zoning department on Monday morning, and we're prepared to pursue injunctive relief if you don't voluntarily comply with our requirements. The legal costs alone should convince you that cooperation is in your best interests. That threat crystallized something for me about the dynamic I was dealing with. These weren't concerned neighbors trying to preserve community standards through reasonable discussion and compromise. These were people who were accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and legal pressure, counting on their targets being too overwhelmed or financially constrained to fight back effectively. But they'd picked the wrong target this time. After years of navigating complex cryptocurrency regulations and dealing with government agencies that actually had legitimate authority, a homeowners association's threats didn't carry much weight with me. More importantly, I had the financial resources to fight back if necessary. And I was curious enough about the legal situation to want to understand exactly what kind of game they were playing. As the 3 board members prepared to leave my property, Serafina delivered what she clearly intended as a final intimidating message. This community has standards, Mr. Kensington, and we protect those standards vigorously. I suggest you use the next 72 hours wisely to consider whether you really want to test our resolve on this matter. After they left, I spent the rest of the day exploring the property more thoroughly and thinking about the encounter. Something about their behavior didn't add up, particularly their intense focus on maritime activities in what was obviously an active harbor community. If commercial fishing operations were such a problem for the neighborhood, why had the community been developed in an area with existing maritime infrastructure? That evening, I called my brother Caspian, who had been practicing maritime law in Seattle for 12 years and specialized in waterfront property disputes. When I described the confrontation and the threats about commercial fishing violations, I could hear him chuckling on the other end of the line. That sounds like classic HOA overreach. But there might be more to this situation than you realize. Waterfront properties often come with complex rights and responsibilities that previous owners didn't fully understand or document properly. Before you do anything else, you need to get a complete title search and find out exactly what maritime rights come with your property. Caspian recommended a colleague of his who specialized in maritime property law, a sharp attorney named Victoria Sterling, who'd handled similar cases throughout the Pacific Northwest. He also suggested that I document everything about my interactions with the HOA and start researching the actual legal status of my property, rather than relying on what anyone had told me during the purchase process. That night, I had trouble sleeping, not because I was worried about the HOA's threats, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important about the situation. The encounter with Serafina and her board members had felt performative, like they were following a script they'd used before with other property owners. But their confidence about the outcome suggested they knew something I didn't, and that knowledge gap made me uncomfortable. The next morning, I decided to spend some time exploring the harbor and talking to other boat owners to get a better sense of the local maritime community. What I discovered was fascinating and more complex than I had expected. The harbor supported a diverse mix of operations, from commercial fishing and charter services to recreational boating and maritime tourism. But everyone I talked to seemed to know something about my property that I didn't. When I introduced myself to the captain of a charter fishing boat, his reaction was immediate recognition rather than the polite introduction I'd expected. "You're the new owner of the Piton place. We've been wondering who was going to take over the operation now that old Harold's gone." He seemed to assume I knew what operation he was referring to, and when I asked for clarification, he looked confused. The Marina operations, the commercial licenses, the fuel concessions. Harold ran a pretty significant business out of that property for 30 years. Didn't the real estate agent explain any of that when you bought the place? His questions made it clear that there was a whole side to my property purchase that I'd completely missed, and that Mrs. Piton either didn't understand or hadn't thought to mention. I spent the rest of the morning talking to Marina workers, boat captains and longtime harbor residents, and a picture began to emerge that was radically different from what I'd understood about my property. According to multiple sources, Harold Piton hadn't just owned a waterfront cabin with a private pier. He'd operated a small but successful marina business that provided services to the commercial fishing fleet, maintained fuel concessions for recreational boaters, and held various licenses for maritime commerce in the harbor. The more I learned, the more I realized that those 30 boat keys misses Piton had given me weren't random pieces of hardware her husband had collected over the years. They were access keys to various aspects of a marina operation that I had accidentally inherited, along with the property. And if that was true, then Serafina's threats about commercial fishing violations weren't just inappropriate. They were potentially interfering with legitimate business operations that predated her HOA by decades. By Monday morning, I had a list of questions that needed immediate answers, and I was beginning to suspect that my confrontation with the Coastal Haven HOA was about to become much more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The first thing I needed to do was contact Victoria Sterling and get a complete legal analysis of exactly what I'd bought. The second thing was to figure out why Serafina Westmont was so determined to shut down maritime activities that the community had apparently coexisted with for 30 years. But as I prepared to make those calls, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something personal about Serafina's hostility, something that went beyond normal HOA enforcement. Her reaction to the commercial fishing boat captain's wave had been too intense, too territorial for someone who was simply concerned about community aesthetics. The phone rang at 7:30 a.m., interrupting my morning coffee and planning session. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar and unwelcome. "Mr. Kensington, this is Serafina Westmont. I'm calling to inform you that we've decided to expedite our enforcement timeline due to additional violations we observed over the weekend. You now have 24 hours to begin dismantling your pier. or will be filing for emergency injunctive relief. The escalation caught me off guard, not because I was intimidated by the threat, but because I couldn't figure out what additional violations she was talking about. I'd been careful not to do anything that could be construed as commercial activity, and I had spent most of the weekend talking to neighbors rather than using my boat or pier. What additional violations are you referring to, Serafina? I was very careful this weekend not to engage in any activities that you might consider problematic, so I'm not sure what changes you're seeing that would justify shortening your timeline. Her response revealed more about her motivations than she probably intended. We have photographic evidence of you conducting unauthorized maritime business meetings throughout the weekend, clearly establishing commercial intent that violates our residential zoning protections. The satisfaction in her voice suggested she thought she'd caught me in some kind of trap, but her accusation was so far from reality that it almost made me laugh. The conversations I'd had with marina workers and boat captains were obviously research, not business meetings, and anyone who had actually observed them would have understood that immediately. Unless Serafina was deliberately misinterpreting innocent interactions to justify her predetermined conclusion, which seemed increasingly likely given the pattern of her behavior, I decided to test my theory about her motivations by pushing back a little harder than I had during our first encounter. Serafina, I think you're misunderstanding both my activities and your authority in this situation. I've done some research since our last conversation, and I'm not convinced that your HOA has any legitimate jurisdiction over my property or my activities. Before this goes any further, I think we should clarify exactly what legal authority you're claiming. The silence that followed my challenge was telling. When she finally responded, her voice had shifted from confident authority to something that sounded more like barely controlled anger. Mr. Kensington, you clearly don't understand how serious this situation is or how determined we are to protect our community's interests. I suggest you consult with qualified legal counsel before you make any decisions you'll regret. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about the dynamics I was dealing with. Serafina's escalation from 72 hours to 24 hours wasn't based on any new information or legitimate violations. It was a pressure tactic designed to force me into compliance before I had time to research my rights or consult with attorneys. That realization crystallized my decision about how to handle the situation. Instead of trying to negotiate or compromise with someone who was clearly operating in bad faith, I was going to find out exactly what my legal position was and then respond from a position of strength rather than uncertainty. I called Victoria Sterling's office and explained the situation to her paralegal, emphasizing the urgency created by Serafina's abbreviated timeline. Victoria called me back within 2 hours and agreed to take the case. But she warned me that maritime property law was complex and that we might uncover complications I wasn't expecting. Our first step, she explained, would be a comprehensive title search and analysis of all maritime rights associated with my property. The second step would be researching the legal foundation of the HOA's claimed authority over waterfront activities. And the third step would be determining what kind of business operations, if any, I'd inherited along with the property. Victoria's questions about my purchase process revealed just how much important information had been glossed over or omitted entirely during the transaction. Had anyone explained the commercial licenses associated with the property? Did I have documentation of existing business relationships or contracts? Was I aware of any ongoing revenue streams from marina operations? The answer to all of those questions was no, which meant I was potentially sitting on business assets worth significantly more than the $900,000 I'd paid for the property. But it also meant that Serafina's attempts to shut down maritime activities could be interfering with legitimate commercial operations that she had no authority to restrict. By Wednesday afternoon, Victoria had preliminary results from her research, and she asked me to come to her office for a meeting that would change everything about how I understood my situation. The tone of her voice when she called suggested that what she'd discovered was significant and possibly game-changing for my confrontation with the Coastal Haven HOA. As I drove to her office, I found myself thinking about the irony of the situation. I'd bought the waterfront property as a simple retreat from the complexity of cryptocurrency business, looking for something peaceful and straightforward. Instead, I'd stumbled into a maritime property dispute that was turning out to be far more complex and potentially valuable than anything I'd dealt with in the digital world. But I was also beginning to feel a sense of anticipation about whatever Victoria had discovered. Serafina's aggressive tactics and premature escalation suggested she was either very confident about her legal position or very worried about something I might find out. Either way, I was about to learn which one it was, and I had a feeling the answer was going to surprise everyone involved in this dispute. Victoria's office overlooked Elliott Bay, and as I sat across from her mahogany desk, I could see commercial vessels moving through the shipping lanes in the distance. She had 3 thick folders spread out in front of her, each one labeled with different aspects of my property research, and her expression carried the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd uncovered something significant. What I'm about to tell you is going to fundamentally change how you understand your property purchase and your position in this dispute with the HOA. She opened the first folder and pulled out a stack of legal documents that looked considerably more official than anything I'd seen during my original closing process. You didn't just buy a waterfront cabin with a private pier, you bought a controlling interest in Blackwater Maritime Operations, a commercial marina business that's been operating continuously since 1987. The words hit me like a physical impact, and I had to ask her to repeat what she'd just said, because it seemed too significant to be true. According to the documentation Victoria had uncovered, Harold Peaton hadn't just owned my property. He'd used it as the headquarters for a marina operation that controlled 43 commercial boat slips, fuel concessions for the entire harbor, and exclusive licensing agreements with the Coast Guard for training operations. But that wasn't even the most shocking part of what she'd discovered. Victoria pulled out a harbor map that showed property boundaries I'd never seen before, with my small waterfront parcel highlighted in red and connected to an intricate network of maritime infrastructure that extended throughout the entire harbor area. The Coastal Haven residential development, where Serafina lived and served as HOA president, was built on land that Harold Peaton had leased to the developers in 1995. The implications of that revelation were staggering. Serafina wasn't just threatening to interfere with my property rights, she was threatening to disrupt business operations on land that I technically owned. Every house in her precious HOA community existed because Harold Peaton had agreed to lease waterfront acreage to residential developers. And now that lease agreement had transferred to me along with everything else. Victoria continued explaining the legal complexities while I tried to process the magnitude of what I'd accidentally purchased. The marina operations generated approximately $2.3 million in annual revenue through various streams, including slip rentals, fuel sales, charter boat partnerships, and Coast Guard training contracts. Harold had been essentially running a small maritime empire, and Mrs. Peaton had inherited something she didn't understand and couldn't manage. When she sold me the property for $900,000, she had unknowingly transferred business assets worth potentially 20 times that amount. The massive ring of boat keys she'd given me wasn't random hardware, it was access to every aspect of a marina operation that employed 37 people and served as the economic foundation for the entire harbor community. But Victoria saved the biggest bombshell for last. She pulled out a folder marked Legal Violations and showed me documentation proving that Serafina's actions over the past week had already cost the marina business significant money through disrupted operations. 2 charter fishing companies had canceled contracts because they'd heard about HOA interference with marina management. A Coast Guard training exercise had been postponed because of uncertainty about facility access, and 3 commercial fishing vessels had moved their operations to a competitor's facility to avoid potential complications. The financial damages from Serafina's interference totaled $87,000 so far, and they were accumulating daily as word spread through the maritime community about the dispute. Victoria explained that maritime commerce law provided strong protections for established business operations and that Serafina's threats constituted illegal interference with interstate commerce since many of the affected businesses operated across state lines. I left Victoria's office feeling like I'd stepped into an alternate reality, where my simple property purchase had transformed me into a maritime business mogul with legal claims against the very people who'd been threatening me. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings as Victoria helped me understand the full scope of what I'd inherited and developed a strategy for dealing with Serafina's continued harassment. Meanwhile, Serafina had escalated her campaign against my property to include what she called community safety concerns. She had organized a petition among HOA members claiming that unauthorized commercial maritime activities posed risks to residential water quality and neighborhood security. She had also contacted local media outlets with a story about how commercial fishing operations were threatening the character of an upscale waterfront community. Her media strategy backfired spectacularly when a reporter from the Harbor Business Journal started investigating her claims and discovered the actual ownership structure of the Marina operations. The resulting article, published on Thursday morning, was headlined, "HOA President Unknowingly Battles Her Own Landlord Over Maritime Rights," and included quotes from longtime harbor workers who described Harold Peaton's operation as a model of environmental responsibility and community partnership. But Serafina wasn't backing down despite the negative publicity. On Friday afternoon, she called an emergency HOA meeting at the community center, promising members that she had definitive legal ammunition to resolve the commercial fishing problem once and for all. She'd hired what she described as a top maritime attorney from a downtown firm, and she was confident that community pressure combined with legal threats would force me to abandon my supposedly illegal business activities. I decided to attend the meeting, not to defend myself against her accusations, but to finally reveal the truth about what she was actually fighting. Victoria agreed to accompany me, and we prepared a presentation that would demonstrate exactly how wrong Serafina had been about every aspect of this dispute. The Coastal Haven Community Center was packed when we arrived, with nearly every HOA member in attendance and several local reporters who'd been following the story. Serafina had positioned herself at the front of the room with her hired attorney, a nervous-looking man in an expensive suit who kept consulting his notes and checking his phone. She opened the meeting with a dramatic presentation about how commercial fishing operations were destroying the community's carefully maintained waterfront ambiance. She showed photographs of my modest fishing boat and basic equipment, describing them as evidence of unauthorized industrial activity that violated both HOA covenants and county zoning regulations. Her hired attorney then delivered what was clearly intended to be the knockout punch, explaining how maritime commerce law prohibited residential waterfront properties from engaging in commercial fishing without proper licensing and environmental clearances. He emphasized the serious financial penalties for violations and suggested that immediate legal action was necessary to protect the community's interests. The audience was clearly convinced by their presentation, and I could see hostile looks directed toward me as Serafina painted a picture of a reckless newcomer who was destroying their neighborhood for personal profit. Several people made comments about property values and community standards, and there was general agreement that something needed to be done to stop my alleged violations. That's when Victoria stood up and asked permission to address the meeting. Serafina looked annoyed by the interruption, but agreed to allow a brief response before proceeding to vote on legal action against me. Victoria walked to the front of the room with her briefcase and began setting up documents on the presentation table. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Victoria Sterling, and I'm a maritime property attorney representing Mr. Kensington. Before you vote on any legal action, I think you should understand exactly what situation you're dealing with and who you're actually threatening to sue." She opened her briefcase and pulled out the harbor map, showing the true ownership boundaries of the Marina operations. As she unfolded the large document and attached it to the easel, I could see confusion spreading through the audience as they tried to understand what they were looking at. This is a current property survey of the harbor area, updated as of last week. The red sections indicate property owned by Blackwater Maritime Operations, which Mr. Kensington acquired along with his residential purchase. Victoria used a laser pointer to highlight the various sections of Marina property, including the fuel depot, the commercial slips, and the Coast Guard training facilities. But the most interesting part of this map is the yellow section, which shows the coastal haven residential development. Victoria moved her laser pointer to highlight the entire HOA community, including Serafina's house and the community center where we were currently meeting. This entire residential area exists on land that's leased from Blackwater Maritime Operations under a 99-year agreement signed in 1995. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as people began to understand the implications of what Victoria was explaining. Serafina's face had gone completely pale, and her hired attorney was frantically flipping through his notes as if trying to find some reference to the information Victoria was presenting. Victoria continued her presentation with documentation of the Marina's commercial operations, including the Coast Guard contracts, the charter fishing partnerships, and the fuel concessions that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue. She explained how Harold Peaton had built a successful maritime business while maintaining excellent relationships with the residential community and how that balance had been disrupted only by Serafina's recent interference. But the most devastating part of Victoria's presentation was her documentation of the financial damages caused by Serafina's actions. She displayed contracts that had been canceled, training exercises that had been postponed, and commercial relationships that had been damaged by the uncertainty created by her threats against the Marina operations. Mrs. Westmont's interference with legitimate maritime commerce has already cost Mr. Kensington's operation $87,000 in documented losses, with additional damages accumulating daily. Under federal maritime commerce law, this constitutes illegal restraint of trade, and the responsible parties can be held personally liable for all resulting financial harm. The audience was completely silent now, and I could see people exchanging glances that suggested they were beginning to understand how badly they'd been misled about the situation. Serafina looked like she wanted to disappear, but Victoria wasn't finished with her revelations. "There's one more aspect of this situation that I think the community should understand." Victoria pulled out the lease agreement that governed the residential development and held it up for everyone to see. Under the terms of this lease, the residential community pays annual fees to the Marina operation for waterfront access and harbor usage rights. Those fees are currently collected through your HOA assessments and forwarded to the Marina owner. That meant every person in the room had been indirectly paying money to support the very business operations that Serafina had been trying to shut down. The irony was almost too perfect to believe, but Victoria had documentation proving that the HOA's own financial records showed regular payments to Harold Peaton's Marina operation stretching back nearly 30 years. Serafina finally found her voice and tried to salvage the situation by attacking the validity of Victoria's information. This is obviously some kind of fabrication designed to intimidate our community into backing down from legitimate enforcement actions. "I demand to see original documents and independent verification of these outrageous claims." Victoria smiled and gestured toward the back of the room, where I noticed several people I'd met during my weekend conversations at the harbor. Captain Morrison from the Sea Titan charter operation, Elena Rodriguez from the fuel depot, and James Wright from the Coast Guard training facility had all attended the meeting as witnesses. Captain Morrison stood up and addressed the room with the kind of authority that comes from 30 years of maritime experience. "Ma'am, I've been working with Harold Peaton's operation since 1991. And everything this attorney just told you is absolutely correct, mister. Kensington is the new owner of the marina that employs most of the boat captains in this harbor and provides the fuel for every recreational vessel you people operate. Elena Rodriguez confirmed the financial relationships between the marina and the residential community, explaining how the fuel depot had been providing discounted services to HOA members for decades as part of the original lease agreement. James Wright described the Coast Guard training contracts and their importance to maritime safety throughout the region. By the time the witnesses finished their statements, it was clear that Serafina had not only been wrong about the legal situation, but had been actively interfering with business operations that directly benefited her own community. The mood in the room had shifted from hostility toward me to anger toward her for creating an unnecessary crisis based on her misunderstanding of the facts. But the final blow came when Victoria revealed the personal liability implications for Serafina's actions. Under maritime commerce law, individuals who knowingly interfere with legitimate business operations can be held personally responsible for all resulting damages, including lost profits, canceled contracts, and legal expenses. Mrs. Westmont, you're facing potential personal liability of over $200,000 for the damages your interference has caused to Mr. Kensington's business operations. Additionally, your actions may have violated the lease agreement that allows this residential community to exist, potentially giving Mr. Kensington grounds to terminate the entire development agreement. The threat of losing their homes and community was enough to turn the entire HOA membership against Serafina. People who had been supporting her enforcement actions an hour earlier were now demanding her resignation and asking what they needed to do to repair the relationship with the marina operations. Serafina tried to maintain some dignity as her world collapsed around her. But it was clear that she'd lost all credibility with the community she'd claimed to be protecting. Her hired attorney was packing up his materials and preparing to leave, obviously unwilling to continue representing someone who'd hired him based on completely false information about the legal situation. I finally stood up and addressed the room, trying to strike a balance between asserting my rights and maintaining the positive relationship Harold Peaton had built with the residential community. I never had any intention of disrupting the partnership between the marina operations and your neighborhood. Harold Peaton built something special here, and I want to continue that tradition of cooperation and mutual benefit. But I also made it clear that Serafina's behavior had been unacceptable and that there would be consequences for the damage she'd caused. The marina operation employed nearly 40 people and served as an economic anchor for the entire harbor community. Her attempts to shut down legitimate business activities based on her personal prejudices had hurt real families and threatened the livelihood of people who'd done nothing wrong. Victoria negotiated a settlement agreement on the spot, with Serafina agreeing to pay $65,000 in damages for the business disruption she'd caused and to resign immediately from her position as HOA president. The community also agreed to formalize their partnership with the marina through updated agreements that would prevent future misunderstandings about authority and responsibilities. 3 weeks later, Serafina's house went up for sale with a reduced price sign that suggested she was motivated to leave the area quickly. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Margaret Chen, who actually understood maritime history, worked with me to organize a community appreciation event, celebrating 35 years of successful partnership between the residential development and the marina operations. Standing on my pier that evening, watching families from the neighborhood enjoy boat rides and fishing lessons provided by my marina staff, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that first confrontation with Serafina. I'd come to the waterfront looking for simplicity and peace, and instead, I discovered that I was the owner of a thriving maritime business that connected me to a community in ways I'd never expected. The irony wasn't lost on me that Serafina's attempts to force me out of the neighborhood had actually helped me discover the true value of what I'd purchased, and my role in supporting the local maritime economy, her hostile confrontation, had led directly to my understanding of assets worth millions of dollars and my position as a significant employer and community partner. But perhaps the most satisfying part of the resolution was knowing that Harold Piton's legacy was secure and that the marina operation he'd built would continue serving the harbor community for decades to come. Mrs. Piton called me a few weeks after the settlement to thank me for honoring her husband's work and maintaining the positive relationships he'd cultivated throughout his career. The cryptocurrency millions that had enabled me to buy the property turned out to be small change compared to the maritime business I'd inherited. But more importantly, I'd found something that digital assets could never provide: a connection to a physical community and a sense of purpose that went beyond personal wealth accumulation. Every morning when I walked down to the pier, I was reminded that sometimes the best revenge against people who try to diminish you isn't getting even. It's discovering that you were already more powerful than they realized, and that their attempts to tear you down only revealed their own ignorance and insecurity. Serafina had stormed onto my property, demanding that I tear down my pier, never knowing that she was standing on land I owned and threatening business operations that employed her neighbors and supported her community. The woman who had tried to make me feel small and unwelcome had learned that she was actually the outsider, fighting against forces much larger and more established than her petty territorial ambitions. And as I watched the sunset paint the harbor in shades of gold and orange, with my commercial vessels returning from successful fishing runs and my charter boats bringing happy families back to shore, I realized that finding my place in this waterfront community had given me something more valuable than all the cryptocurrency profits in the world: a sense of belonging that no one could take away, and a business that connected me to the rhythms of the sea and the lives of people who understood what it meant to work with their hands and build something lasting. The boat keys that had started this whole adventure now opened doors to opportunities I'd never imagined, and every day brought new proof that Harold Piton's 35-year investment in community partnership had been the foundation for something much bigger than any of us had realized. 2 months after Serafina's departure, I was sitting in what had been Harold's office, a cluttered room above the Marina's main building that I'd been slowly organizing and modernizing. Among the filing cabinets and maritime charts, I discovered additional documentation that revealed just how extensive Harold's operation had been. There were contracts with fishing cooperatives from 3 different states, environmental partnership agreements with marine conservation groups, and correspondence with federal agencies about potential expansion of the Coast Guard training facilities. But the most intriguing discovery was a folder marked Future Development that contained Harold's handwritten notes about plans he'd never had the chance to implement. He'd been negotiating with a luxury yacht manufacturer about establishing a service facility in the harbor, and he'd identified potential sites for expanding the marina to accommodate larger vessels and additional commercial operations. Reading through Harold's vision for the marina's future, I realized that my accidental inheritance came with opportunities far beyond what I'd understood during my confrontation with Serafina. The infrastructure was already in place to support significant expansion, and the relationships Harold had built with regulatory agencies would make permitting new facilities much easier than starting from scratch. I called Caspian to discuss the expansion possibilities, and his enthusiasm was immediate and infectious. Dash, you're sitting on a gold mine that most people spend decades trying to build. The combination of established commercial relationships, prime waterfront real estate, and existing regulatory approvals is worth significantly more than the current revenue numbers suggest. He recommended bringing in a maritime business consultant to evaluate the expansion potential and develop a strategic plan for growing the operation while maintaining its community partnerships. Within a week, I was meeting with Rebecca Torres, a former Coast Guard officer who'd transitioned into maritime business development and had experience helping family operations modernize and expand. Rebecca's assessment confirmed what I'd suspected about the marina's untapped potential. The current facilities were operating at about 60% capacity, which meant immediate opportunities for increasing revenue without major infrastructure investments. More importantly, the harbor's location and existing relationships positioned it perfectly for several emerging trends in maritime commerce, including ecotourism, sustainable fishing practices, and luxury vessel services. Her recommendation was to pursue a phased expansion that would double the marina's capacity over 3 years, while adding complementary services like boat repair, marine education programs, and specialty charter operations. The projected return on investment was substantial enough to justify using cryptocurrency profits to fund the development, and the timeline would allow for careful integration with community interests. But before committing to any expansion plans, I wanted to ensure that the residential community remained supportive of the marina's growth. Margaret Chen and I organized a series of neighborhood meetings where Rebecca presented the development, proposals, and solicited feedback from HOA members about their concerns and priorities. The response was overwhelmingly positive, partly because people had learned to appreciate the economic benefits the marina provided to the entire area, and partly because they understood that responsible growth was preferable to stagnation or potential sale to less community-minded operators. Several residents volunteered to serve on an advisory committee that would provide ongoing input about expansion decisions and community impact. One of the most enthusiastic supporters was Eleanor Patterson, a retired marine biologist who had moved to Coastal Haven specifically because of its proximity to active maritime operations. She proposed partnering with local schools to develop educational programs that would teach children about marine ecosystems, sustainable fishing practices, and maritime careers. The educational component became a cornerstone of our expansion planning, with dedicated facilities for classroom instruction, hands-on learning experiences, and internship programs that would connect young people with maritime career opportunities. The Coast Guard training facility expressed immediate interest in collaborating on safety education and youth development programs. 3 months into the expansion planning process, I received a call that brought the story full circle in an unexpected way. Mrs. Peaton's nephew, David Peaton, contacted me about visiting the marina to see how Harold's operation was developing under new ownership. He explained that he was a marine engineer working in Alaska and had always regretted not being involved in his uncle's business during Harold's lifetime. David's visit turned into a week-long consultation that revealed additional aspects of Harold's operation I'd never discovered. He'd worked summers at the marina during college and understood the technical systems and supplier relationships in ways that weren't documented in Harold's files. More importantly, he shared stories about Harold's vision for the marina that helped me understand the values and principles that had guided 35 years of successful operation. Harold always said that the marina business was really about connecting people to the water and helping them understand their relationship with the marine environment. David explained as we walked through the facilities. He believed that commercial success and environmental stewardship weren't competing priorities. They were complementary aspects of a sustainable maritime business. That philosophy became the guiding principle for our expansion efforts, with every new facility designed to demonstrate best practices in environmental protection while providing economic opportunities for the local community. We installed solar panels to power the fuel depot, implemented advanced water filtration systems to prevent harbor contamination, and established partnerships with marine research institutions to monitor the health of local ecosystems. The transformation of the marina over the following year was remarkable, not just in terms of physical improvements and increased business activity, but in the strengthening of relationships between the maritime operation and the residential community. What had started as Serafina's attempt to create conflict between commercial and residential interests had evolved into a model of cooperation that attracted attention. From urban planning experts and maritime development consultants, the local newspaper ran a feature story about the Marina's expansion that highlighted the community partnership approach and its success in balancing economic growth with environmental responsibility. The article brought inquiries from other waterfront communities facing similar challenges about integrating commercial maritime operations with residential development. Rebecca Torres suggested that we formalize our community partnership model into a consulting service that could help other harbors develop sustainable growth strategies. The idea of exporting Harold's vision to benefit other maritime communities was appealing, and it represented a natural evolution of the business beyond its original geographic boundaries. By the end of my first year as Marina owner, the operation employed 62 people, generated over $4 million in annual revenue, and had become a regional model for sustainable maritime development. The Coastal Haven residential community had not only embraced their partnership with the Marina, but had become advocates for the expansion and its benefits to the broader harbor area. Standing on the observation deck of the new Marine Education Center, watching children from 3 different school districts participate in hands-on learning experiences about marine biology and sustainable fishing practices, I reflected on how dramatically my understanding of success had evolved since my cryptocurrency days. The digital millions had provided the financial foundation for purchasing the property, but the real wealth came from discovering my connection to a community that valued long-term relationships over short-term profits. Harold Peaton's legacy wasn't just a successful business operation. It was a demonstration that economic activity could strengthen rather than undermine the social and environmental fabric of a community. Serafina's attempt to force me out of the neighborhood had inadvertently led to my discovery of assets and opportunities worth far more than anything I'd achieved in the cryptocurrency world. But more importantly, her hostility had motivated me to understand and embrace Harold's vision for community partnership in ways that might never have happened if the transition had been smooth and conflict-free. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd tried to diminish my presence in the community had actually been the catalyst for my becoming one of its most significant economic and social contributors. Her fear of commercial maritime activities had led directly to the expansion and improvement of those very operations, creating benefits for everyone she'd claimed to be protecting.